This is an ABC podcast.
Hello and welcome to this week's Health Report with me, Norman Swan. Last week, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, announced an independent inquiry into the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
The magnitude of this pandemic, which has touched virtually everyone in the world, clearly deserves a commensurate evaluation, an honest evaluation. This is not a standard report that ticks a box and is then put on a shelf to gather dust. This is something we take seriously.
The panel is to be co-chaired by the former president of Liberia and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who had to deal with the Ebola epidemic in her country 6 years ago, and Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, who went on to lead the United Nations Development Programme. The findings of this inquiry will draw major international attention given how the pandemic has spread globally and the unanswered questions about its origins, not least because no one knows when the next pandemic might hit. Helen Clark spoke to me yesterday from Auckland.
Thank you.
So it's interesting, the title for this, which is the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. That doesn't sound like a review of what's going on.
So the mandate essentially comes from the World Health Assembly resolution, which Australia was a key part, obviously, in promoting. And it does want an independent and impartial review of what has happened and how the WHO has responded. But that also then gets you into some extent how member states have responded to the WHO. And we're also being asked to look forward and make recommendations about future preparedness. If there's one thing that really concerns me, it is that if we have another disease like this come along fast on the heels of this, when economies around the world have been literally knocked for six by this, are we in any shape to deal with it at all? So I think it's quite urgent to be learning the lessons from what's happened. They're still evolving, of course, because the pandemic is with us for some time yet, but we need to learn fast how to build greater resilience to adverse events like this.
What are the terms of reference? Or are you writing your own?
The World Health Assembly resolution is quite detailed. It does talk about looking at the effectiveness of the mechanisms which the WHO has. It talks about looking at the international health regulations under which these public health emergencies of international concern are declared, and to see to what extent all past recommendations for their improvement have been followed. It looks at whether the WHO has, or how it's played with the other UN agencies, played a role there. So there is that retrospectivity in it, but the key thing the World Health Assembly wants to know is how to move forward from here, because I think it would probably be an understatement to say that as a world, we have been somewhat flat-footed in dealing with this. Individual countries have done things relatively well or relatively badly, but as a world, we haven't had a great collective effort.
It sounds very WHO-centred rather than pandemic-centred.
Well, of course, the WHO has come under quite substantial attack, and so the resolution is certainly wanting to look at the WHO's performance. But the terms of reference will go wider than that to look at what recommendations need to be made about ensuring greater global health security for the future. And of course, if you look at it in that context, the WHO, yes, is the global health lead currently, but it's each country that also needs to be prepared. So let's see. We, of course, have just been announced over the last 3 days. We will start to get down to talking about developing terms of reference along the lines that the World Health Assembly has mandated. We don't want a sort of broad fishing expedition that would take years to complete. We've got to be practical, but I hope also be useful.
Now, one of the criticisms of UN procedures, and this comes to the selection of your panel, is that ideologically sound comes to mind as a phrase, which is you've got to have people from this part of the world, you've got to have so many representatives here and there, rather than, and I can say this rather than you can say it, necessarily the quality of the individuals. It's ticking a box in terms of where people should come from and who they should represent, rather than necessarily expertise. It's one of the big criticisms of UN procedures. To what extent are you going to get round that with this panel in terms of who you need on it?
Well, that's a critical decision. What is the range of attributes and skills that need to be on the panel? I imagine that Dr. Tedros has come to me and to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, because we're former leaders of governments. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, of course, led her country through Ebola, which was a searing experience. So she has first-hand knowledge of managing an epidemic. Both of us are seen as independent-minded and well-known in the international system, but we need support. We need a lot of skills on that panel. Now, of course, it will be important to have geographical diversity on it, but in that geographical diversity, we must find the right skills and attributes to help us do a good report.
A lot of people outside government around the world want to know where this started, where it came from. It's almost an obsession. To what extent will you be looking at the origins of the pandemic?
So there is, by the way, a science delegation from WHO that has landed in China just in the last day or two, which is off on that mission. So I think when we get our panel together, what we need to ascertain is what information is being collected from different sources and missions like this, which would be relevant to the inquiry, and what more within the terms of reference that we have could we do. There's many open questions around this at the moment.
One of the features observing the pandemic so far has been, it looks like a failure of multilateralism. It looks like countries have been doing their own thing. Britain's been doing their own thing. Even within the European Union, been doing their own thing. Certainly the United States has, Latin American countries. There doesn't, at first sight, seem to be much cooperation going on.
Yes, that is true, and I feel, sitting on the outside as I have been watching this intensely since around mid-February, that the WHO has pretty much been left to try to cope. But what became apparent quite early on was that this had moved beyond being a health crisis, serious as that was, to being a full-blown economic and social crisis. And at that point, you need more actors. I have been part of 2 letters now signed by many dozens of former heads of state and government to the G20 leaders, setting out an agenda of what we, on the best advice we've had, believe needs to be done to support the international financial institutions, to support the more than 100 developing and emerging economies who have asked for emergency support. And the IMF, for example, cannot support all those countries right now with cash. So there is if you like, a failure of global leadership on a number of dimensions. The Security Council has proved unable to agree on the kind of resolution that was agreed on Ebola in 2014 when it declared Ebola to be a threat to global peace and security and asked every member state to do whatever it could. We don't have that framing either. So I think the issue with our report will be to obviously need to be able to touch on the many facets of a pandemic. It goes beyond the leadership that the WHO could conceivably provide. It goes into what are the role of other institutions and leadership bodies, and then how do we get people playing as a team rather than each for his own.
You're very experienced on the international stage. After leaving the Prime Ministership, you've led a major UN agency. And observing now how China is behaving in the international scene and the United States, there's major powers are going alone and the United States has foreshadowed leaving WHO in the middle of next year. Do you foresee much cooperation from China, Russia, United States?
I certainly hope so. When I was beaming into Dr. Tedros's briefing to the member states, which was public last Thursday night, the representative of China, for example, did speak and did welcome the review as timely. And I would, very much hope that China would want to be heard in the course of the review. I am also pretty positive about getting informed feedback from the United States. The Centers for Disease Control have, many globally acknowledged experts. And of course had people in the WHO from the earliest stage with this epidemic as well. So I think it will be very important that we can reach those people in those key countries who can support and give assistance to the review.
I mean, just last week there were reports from China that yet again swine flu had made the jump into humans, hopefully not in pandemic form, but the influenza virus in particular had pandemic genes in it. I mean, the next pandemic could be next year.
That's my concern. That's my concern. If we're still in the state we're in now, how does the world cope? I've been talking to former colleagues around the world about the state that the countries that they're in for the UN system are in at the moment, and it is very, very dire. So while our review takes place during the pandemic, we've got an eye on the next one, which may not be as far away as one would think.
So in a world where bilateralism or unilateralism rules rather than multilateralism and a global response, what traction could recommendations from a panel such as yours, no matter how cogent they are, have?
Well, I would hope that at the very least it would send very strong signals to each country about the kinds of measures they need to put in place to build resilience to future pandemics. Again, sitting as I do in Auckland, New Zealand, I have watched for months as the WHO has exhorted countries to do certain things, and that's all it can do. It can exhort. It doesn't have any powers. And if countries don't follow that advice, well, we end up in the mess we're in, frankly. You can never hospitalise your way out of an epidemic or pandemic like this. You have to use basic public health measures of social distancing, isolating, testing, tracing, the things we've become very, very familiar with. So the wake-up call, I think, is that basic public health measures do work, but you need to take them early and you need to keep consistency for quite some time.
I mean, you are going to have to, in the end, argue for enlightened self-interest.
Pretty much, because this affects all of us. And again, sitting in New Zealand, we haven't had a case of community transmission for 70 days. Do we feel secure? Absolutely not. We have people returning to New Zealand as citizens and as permanent residents, and a tiny proportion of those are bringing COVID with them. When someone leaps over the back fence of a quarantine facility, we go into a panic. So while we enjoy a level of health security, our lives are very, very abnormal. It's very difficult to travel anywhere and face 2 weeks quarantine on return. We have no international students. We have no international visitors. This is not a normal life. So until we're all secure, none of us are secure. And I think that's the message that needs to register with every government on earth, that we must play as a team.
So are you and ex-President Sirleaf going to operate at warp speed, as they'd say in Star Wars?
Well, we certainly hope to get a good briefing this week so we can start to put a well-informed secretariat in place and a work program and begin to look at the many suggestions we will get for other members of the panel and for key staffers. I think this is the critical step now to get a process underway which can get us working. I'm certainly hoping that for the most part this can be done virtually for the foreseeable future, because it's not easy for any of us to travel freely at all. I'm under no illusion, by the way, about the size of the challenge. It's geopolitically challenging and, challenging in every sense.
But Zoom might be your friend here, because you don't have to wait till people arrive in Geneva on a plane.
That's correct.
Look, thanks very much for joining us. We might follow you up on this once you're getting going.
Stay in touch.
Former Prime Minister of New Zealand and co-chair of the panel of inquiry into the COVID-19 pandemic, Helen Clark.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast.